The year 1825 could have marked a profound turning point for the vast Russian Empire. Imagine a scenario where the Decembrist uprising did not falter. Instead, it succeeded in its audacious goals. Key military units in St. Petersburg, swayed by promises of reform, might have decisively sided with the rebels. Perhaps a more coordinated leadership among the Decembrists, or a moment of hesitation from loyalist troops, tipped the scales. The iron grip of autocracy, personified by Tsar Nicholas I, would have been broken before it truly began. This initial success would have sent shockwaves not just through Russia, but across a Europe still grappling with the legacy of Napoleon and the stirrings of new revolutions. The old order would have crumbled, making way for an uncertain but hopeful future for the Russian people. The immediate political aftermath would have been tumultuous yet transformative. With the Tsar either deposed, forced to abdicate, or his powers severely curtailed, a provisional government likely formed from the ranks of the Decembrist leaders and sympathetic liberal nobles. Figures like Pavel Pestel or Nikita Muravyov would have stepped into prominent roles tasked with navigating the treacherous waters of regime change. Their primary objective would have been to prevent a counter-revolution and to establish a framework for a new political system. This period would have been fraught with challenges, including internal divisions among the reformers themselves, who held differing views on the extent of liberalization. The very air in the imperial capital would have crackled with anticipation and anxiety as an ancient system gave way. A central achievement of this new government would have been the drafting and promulgation of a liberal constitution. This document would have drawn inspiration from Western European and American examples, enshrining fundamental rights and limiting the power of the state. Concepts such as freedom of speech, assembly, and the press, previously suppressed, would have been introduced, albeit perhaps with initial limitations. The constitution would have likely proposed a legislative body, perhaps a state Duma or Zemsky Soba, with genuine power, elected by a broader, though not necessarily universal, suffrage. The principle of separation of powers would have been a cornerstone, aiming to prevent the return of unchecked autocratic rule that had defined Russia for centuries. The establishment of new governing bodies would have followed swiftly. Depending on the dominant faction within the Decembrist movement, Russia might have become a constitutional monarchy, with a monarch retaining a symbolic or limited executive role, or it could have even experimented with a republican model. Regardless of the precise form, an independent judiciary would have been crucial to uphold the new constitutional order. Local governance, or zemstvos, might have been empowered much earlier, and more significantly than they were historically, fostering a sense of civic participation from the ground up. These institutions would have been the bedrock upon which a liberal Russian state was to be built, fundamentally altering the relationship between the rulers and the ruled. One of the most profound and immediate social changes following a successful Decembrist uprising would have been the abolition of serfdom. The Decembrists almost universally viewed serfdom as a moral abomination and a critical impediment to Russia's progress. Its dismantlement would have been a top priority, liberating millions of peasants from bondage. This act alone would have reshaped the social fabric of the empire more dramatically than any other single reform. The emancipation would not have been without its complexities, particularly regarding land distribution and the economic transition for both former serfs and landowners. However, the principle of personal freedom for all Russians would have been firmly established, a monumental step forward for human dignity within the empire's vast borders. The impact of emancipation on the peasantry and the nobility would have been immense and multifaceted. Peasants, newly freed, would have faced the challenge of establishing independent livelihoods, often with insufficient land or resources. Yet the psychological impact of freedom and the potential for upward mobility would have been powerful motivators. The nobility, stripped of their primary source of unpaid labor, would have been forced to adapt. Some might have struggled, clinging to old ways, while others might have embraced new agricultural techniques or invested in nascent industries. This shift would have fundamentally altered class relations, creating new tensions, but also new opportunities for social and economic interaction beyond the rigid structures of the old regime. This era of newfound freedoms and economic restructuring would have naturally spurred the rise of a liberal middle class. With serfdom abolished and legal reforms promoting enterprise, opportunities for commerce, industry, and professional careers would have expanded significantly. Educated commoners, merchants, and enterprising former serfs could have formed the nucleus of this burgeoning bourgeoisie. This class would have become a crucial pillar of support for the liberal state, advocating for further reforms, economic development, and the protection of property rights. Their growing influence would have been felt in the new legislative bodies, in public discourse, and in the cultural life of the nation, fostering a more dynamic and diverse society. Consequently, Russia would have likely experienced an accelerated period of industrialization much earlier than it did historically. Liberal economic policies, the free movement of labor following emancipation, and the encouragement of private investment would have created a more favorable environment for industrial growth. The development of railways, factories, and mining operations could have begun in earnest in the 1830s and 1840s, rather than decades later. This early industrial spurt would have boosted the Russian economy, increased its self-sufficiency, and begun to close the gap with Western European powers. The demand for skilled labor and technological innovation would also have driven improvements in education and scientific research, further fueling the cycle of progress. A liberalized Russia in 1825 would have dramatically altered the geopolitical landscape of Europe. No longer the gendarme of Europe committed to suppressing revolutionary movements, Russia might have become a surprising, if cautious, supporter of liberal and nationalist aspirations in other countries. The European revolutions of 1830 and 1848 could have found a very different response from St. Petersburg. Instead of intervention to uphold conservative monarchies, a liberal Russian government might have offered diplomatic support or even material aid to reformist movements, particularly those not directly threatening perceived Russian interests. This change would have significantly shifted the balance of power among the conservative and liberal forces shaping the continent's future. Russia's foreign policy would have undergone a significant transformation. While national interests would still guide its actions, the ideological underpinnings would have shifted from autocratic solidarity to a promotion of, or at least sympathy towards, liberal principles. Expansionist tendencies, particularly in Europe, might have been curbed as the focus turned inward towards domestic development and consolidation of the new liberal order. There might have been a greater emphasis on diplomacy and international law rather than military might as the primary tools of foreign engagement. This would not necessarily mean a pacifist Russia, but rather one more inclined to seek peaceful resolutions and build alliances based on shared liberal values, where possible within the complex European system. Relations with other major European powers, such as Great Britain and France, would have been redefined. A liberal Russia could have found more common ground with constitutional Britain, potentially leading to closer economic and even strategic ties. With France, relations might have been more complex, given France's own revolutionary history and shifting political landscape. But the ideological chasm would have been narrower than with an autocratic Tsarist regime. Conversely, relations with the conservative empires of Austria and Prussia might have become more strained, as they would view a liberal Russia with suspicion and as a potential source of instability. This new alignment would have reshaped the concert of Europe, and its ability to manage international crises. The Eastern question concerning the decline of the Ottoman Empire would also have been approached differently. A liberal Russia might have been less overtly aggressive in its ambitions towards Ottoman territories. Instead of seeking direct territorial gains, it might have focused on promoting the autonomy or independence of Christian Balkan nations through diplomatic means, aligning its actions with liberal nationalist principles. This could have led to a more managed decline of Ottoman power in Europe, potentially avoiding some of the larger conflicts that historically arose from this issue, such as the Crimean War, or at least altering their character and alliances. Russia's role as a protector of Orthodox Christians could have been framed within a broader support for self-determination. The challenge of managing ethnic diversity within the vast Russian Empire would have been addressed much earlier and potentially more constructively under a liberal regime. Instead of the Russification policies that characterized later Tsarist rule, a government born from liberal ideals might have opted for a more federal or decentralized state structure. Early concessions to the national aspirations of groups like the Poles, Finns, Ukrainians, and Caucasian peoples could have been considered. Granting cultural autonomy, language rights, and a degree of self-governance might have fostered greater loyalty and reduced the separatist pressures that plagued the empire later in its history. This would have been a radical departure from traditional imperial control. This early engagement with ethnic diversity could have resulted in a more stable and internally cohesive state, for instance, the Kingdom of Poland. Instead of facing repeated suppression of its autonomy, might have evolved into a genuinely self-governing entity within a broader Russian federation. Finland's existing special status could have been strengthened and served as a model for other regions. While nationalist sentiments would not have simply disappeared, a system that provided legitimate avenues for their expression and for self-administration could have channeled these energies constructively. This would have required immense foresight and a willingness to devolve power, challenging for any central government, but the liberal ethos might have provided the necessary impetus for such an experiment. The long-term effects on global history stemming from a liberal Russia in 1825 are profound to contemplate. The trajectory of the 20th century could have been dramatically different. Without the deep-seated grievances that fueled the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, the rise of communism as a global force might have been averted or significantly curtailed. A Russia that had embarked on a path of liberal democracy and industrial capitalism a century earlier would have been a very different player on the world stage. The internal stability and economic strength of such a Russia could have altered the alliances and outcomes of major global conflicts, perhaps even preventing the world wars or changing their scale and nature entirely. Ultimately, a Russia that liberalized in 1825 could have contributed to a more democratic and potentially more peaceful 20th century. The ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, which defined the Cold War, might never have emerged in the same way. Russia's vast resources and human potential, harnessed under a liberal system, could have fostered greater global prosperity and cooperation. While counterfactual history is inherently speculative, the vision of a successful Decembrist uprising offers a tantalizing glimpse of a vastly different world, where the course of Russian and, by extension, global history took a more hopeful and progressive turn much earlier than our own timeline permitted, avoiding much suffering and turmoil.